Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. Episode number 26 of the MMA podcast with a distinctly British flavour. My name is Simon Head. Joining me is my podcasting sparring partner, Mr. Sandhu. How are you, buddy?
I'm very well, Simon. Good to be back on another episode of our fantastic podcast.
Fantastic. I'll leave that to the viewers to judge. By the way, on that topic, if you do listen to this, we would hugely appreciate it. We're going to get the begging in early doors this week, Sandhu.
Yes.
Please do leave us a review on iTunes. It helps push us up the iTunes rankings as well as the downloads that we get, and we're doing all right on the download front, given that it's us two yakking on Skype. It's doing okay. But yeah, any reviews you could leave for us, the more positive the better, obviously, would be much appreciated. 26 shows in, and we're doing this pretty regularly now, which, as Sandhu will probably attest, it took a while to get this thing started and to get me convinced that we could do this on a weekly basis, but we're now off and running. And the UFC season, if you can call it that, is very much up and running as well. We had a bit of a slow start. Now the shows are beginning to come thick and fast. This past weekend, we had UFC Fight Night 104 in Houston, Texas. Coming up next weekend is UFC 208 in Brooklyn, New York. We will preview the former and preview the latter and review the former on this week's show, episode number 26. We might as well just kick straight into this, Sandhu. Fight Night 104, Dennis Bermudez versus the Korean Zombie. Amazing comeback from Chan Sung Jung. 3.5 years out. I don't think that many people were. It wasn't that people weren't giving him a chance. I think everyone knew that he had a chance, but because he was a former world title contender and was pushing Jose Aldo until he had that separated shoulder that eventually saw him lose. That was the last time we saw him in the octagon until this weekend. 3.5 year absence, though, is a long time, especially in MMA when the sport is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And going straight in there with a top 10 contender like Dennis Bermudez. I picked Dennis Bermudez ahead of time to win that fight. I don't think I know anybody who picked Chan Sung Jung to win that fight ahead of time. So for him to win it and to do it with a perfectly placed uppercut like he did, to claim a knockout victory on his return, remarkable stuff from the Korean Zombie. How impressed were you with his performance on his comeback?
Oh, well, I think it's an early contender for comeback of the year, Simon. I mean, I was thinking about this, and you're hard-pressed to see another great comeback this year. You probably got John Jones in the running when he comes back in the summer. If he's able to reclaim his UFC light heavyweight championship, that'll be a comeback of the year story. Let's see if George St. Pierre comes back to the UFC. And if he's going to be put into a title picture, and if he wins a title, that would most certainly be a comeback of the year story. But as of where we are right now in February of 2017, this was just unbelievable, fantastic story. The fact that you referenced Dominic Cruz's return after multiple ACL surgeries was really, really cool to see. The fact that he still had his finger on the pulse, he was still keeping an eye on the situation, even though he was halfway around the world doing his mandatory civilian duty for the South Korean military. And he wasn't really getting too much, hardcore, top level, elite level MMA training. From what I've heard and read, he was perhaps getting an hour here and there every other day, doing what he could. So to come back from that much of an absence and to go straight in a main event slot with a big spotlight on you against a top 10 contender in Dennis Bermudez, who's pretty much in his prime right now, and was he's been on a pretty decent run. He's had his fair share of losses here and there, but like you, Simon, I'd picked him to win the fight, and he did it almost in zombie fashion. Chan Sung Jung, where he took a couple of licks here and there, walked right through them like a zombie, and he got a fantastic uppercut in. There may have been a little kind of conversation about the actual stoppage, which many perhaps felt was a little early, but I think you and me, Simon, are both on the same page where we'd rather it be a little early than too late. And of course, the referee jumped in to stop the fight. and declare Chan Sung Jung the winner. And I think what this does now is it puts him right back in a very, very competitive featherweight division. And there could be some very interesting and tasty matchmaking as we head and roll into the remainder of 2017.
Yeah, it really does. And you just sort of look at that featherweight division and you think, the Korean Zombie versus the Korean Superboy one day, who, maybe. Or I think Jeremy Stevens is itching to fight somebody. Chan Sung Jung could be the guy. Cub Swanson, I think, would make an excellent opponent stylistically. There's options galore for him. And Dennis Bermudez being a number 9 ranked guy, Chan Sung Jung beats him with style points. He's going to jump straight into the top 10, probably just outside that top 5 position. And he's going to be one fight away from a contender fight. I think he's straight back in the mix. It's almost like he hasn't missed a beat. And, that featherweight division just got a little bit more stacked. Really, really looking forward to seeing what they do next with the Korean Zombie. You mentioned the stoppage there. Yeah, I had no problem with that stoppage at all. I think he did knock out Dennis Bermudez, and Bermudez just recovered very quickly. But the telltale sign, and it's amazing how common we see it. The referee sees it, jumps in, and the opponent who's been knocked out and has suddenly recovered his consciousness at least, is trying to shoot a takedown on the ref, which is always a sign that they haven't quite recovered properly, because you don't wear trousers when you're fighting in the octagon. So it's or shiny boots or whatever. So yeah, I thought that was a good stoppage. No complaining really from Dennis Bermudez afterwards. Took it on the chin, so to speak. Was very classy afterwards, and yeah, I mean he's a bit unlucky, I think, in some respects, because he's a talented guy. He's just found himself in a weight class that's just absolutely packed with killers. Perhaps if he was, a few pounds lighter, he'd be a little bit higher up the rankings. He's got all the tools to be a top level fighter. It's just there are so many elite level guys in that featherweight division. But the man who moves on is Chan Sung Jung, and we're looking forward to seeing what happens with him next. The co-main event, Sandhu. I'm a bit surprised that this was the co-main event. First off, I honestly thought we'd see Jessica Andrade versus Angela Hill as the co-main event. What with Andrade being potentially lined up for a championship fight, Angela Hill returning to the UFC as an Invicta World Champion. To me, that was the more sellable co-main event. They went with Felice Herrig against Alexa Grasso, and I think the UFC matchmakers may have thought of this as being a bit of a showcase fight for Alexa Grasso. Didn't turn out quite that way, did it? Felice Herrig put on, I thought, a fantastic performance. Looked absolutely superb. Consistently beat Alexa Grasso to the punch and dominated, really, across 3 rounds. I don't think she lost a round. Grasso, whether she's found her level and she's just not quite there yet, or whether she had, just had a bad day at the office, I'm not so sure. I think she's still very young in her career. We're going to need to see another couple of fights before we know just how good she can be. But Felice Herrig used all her veteran smarts and won that fight convincingly. Really impressed with how she turned out on Saturday night, Sandy.
Yeah, what a feather in her cap to be the first woman to defeat Alexa Grasso. That's going to do wonders for her as she kind of makes a return to action for the UFC. She hasn't been she hasn't really kind of featured too much in the UFC the last couple of years. It's pretty much averaging a fight a year. But she did talk a lot about getting the mental state right, getting her body weight and bits and pieces all in check over the course of the last year. And I thought she put on a really mature veteran performance. She's coming up to almost 19, 20 fights now in professional MMA, but she's got a background in kickboxing as well. She's in her early 30s. She's been around, and I think she's now finally starting to put it all together. And great call out for Paige Van Zandt and potentially Michelle Waterson. She definitely made use of that co-main event spotlight. We always talk about fighters not taking advantage of the post-fight interview moment, whether it's with John Anik or Brian Stann. She definitely took advantage of that moment. And I think if the UFC matchmakers, need another big Fox or an FS1 main or co-main to feature the ladies, I think Felice Herrig versus Paige Van Zandt would be. I think that's the fight to make. What do you think, Si?
Yeah, totally agree. I think I think Michelle Waterson is right up there in championship contention for my money. I think they should be looking to put her, if not in a championship match, then in a title eliminator. We'll talk about the World Championship picture in a strawweight division probably a little bit later on in the show because of a fight that happened earlier in the night. But I think right now the best fight for Felice Herrig would be Paige Van Zandt. I think it fits the bill for a big Fox show. I think it fits what the UFC want to put out on Fox. They've been very keen to push Paige in particular on that platform. She draws eyeballs and TV ratings, so I think it makes sense. Her and Felice, I think, would make for an action-packed fight as well. I think it would be a fun fight to put on. That would be what I would do next. So that was Felice Herrig picking up the win in the co-main event. We'll talk about a bit more strawweight action in a bit, but we'll run down the main card. So James Vick, the Texecutioner, fighting in his home state of Texas, picked up a submission winning as Abel Killer Trujillo, Darce choke. He had plenty of goes at it before he eventually got it locked up and finally forced the tap in the third round. But that was a good performance by him. Vick is always impressed when he's boxing, and he showed us that he's no slouch when it comes to the submissions as well. Abel Trujillo looked, well, I don't know what the difference in height was, but it was huge. And Trujillo's sort of a very squat, sort of very powerfully built lightweight. Could really struggle to get his hands on James Vick in that fight. Even with his superior wrestling skills, Vick was the guy who ended up winning the fight on the mat, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. I thought Vick would either outbox him over 3 rounds, or Trujillo might catch him with a big shot, or maybe ground and pound him. I actually picked Trujillo to win the fight. So, good performance from James Vick, who on his day is as awkward an opponent as you can get at 155 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. That's the old saying, isn't it? And he definitely tried that Darce choke for quite some time before he finally got able to tap out there. But if you actually look at his record, which I'm looking at right now, he has a fair share of submission victories. But I'm like you. You see James Vick. He's a very tall, rangy kind of body type, and you'd think that he'd be able to use that to his advantage and really kind of outbox and outkickbox his opponents. But he's an all-rounded mixed martial artist, and I think the most important thing for this particular fight was he was coming off a loss, his very first loss to Beneil Dariush last June, and sometimes you just don't know how a fighter is going to deal with that very first loss. Sometimes they can tumble out of control, and one loss becomes 2, becomes 3, and then all of a sudden you're out of the UFC. So very important for him to kind of go back to the drawing board, figure a few things out, and get a pretty good victory over a named opponent on a UFC on Fox main card. So good job for James Vick there.
Definitely. And further down the main card, we had 2 pretty sizable shock results. One of them came at 205 pounds. Volkan Özdemir, who is a Swiss fighter, jumped in there with Ovin St. Preux, who was looking to bounce back after that brutal knockout loss to our very own Jimmy the Poster Boy Manor at UFC 204 in Manchester. But it didn't go OSP's way. He lost on the cards, and it was a little bit controversial. I know people who were Octagon side scored the fight for OSP. I think OSP may just about have done enough to win it, but it was very close. I don't think you could argue when it, the scores are 29-28. And that's how they came in, 29-28 twice for Özdemir, who picked up the biggest win of his mixed martial arts career. And OSP all of a sudden is staring at a 3-fight losing streak.
Yeah, I mean, we just spoke about this. James Vick, came off a loss and got back to winning ways. And it's been a very, very difficult year for OSP. He was coming off a win against Rafael Cavalcante, and bang, he was right in there. Main event against John Jones. It doesn't get a bigger profile than that. And he done well for himself, going the distance with John Jones. Obviously, it turned out that he was suffering from a broken arm at some point during the fight pretty early on, which kind of almost added to his performance. But then after that, he loses Jimmy Manuwa, which we were both cage side for in Manchester last October. And now I think a fight that really a lot of people, I believe both of us, picked him to win this one. He should have won, given his stature, given his experience. and that was a major upset. And I don't know where he goes from here now, because that's his third loss in a row and his fourth loss in his last 5 in the UFC. So, and we know that the UFC is trimming the fat, so to speak, with regards to their roster. Not re-upping a few fighters when their contract expires. I don't know how many fights that OSP has left on his contract. If he's got a few, he really needs to make the most of them and make some noise if he wants to stick around in the UFC for much longer.
Yeah, he's got this very sort of laid back, sort of languid fighting style, and it doesn't always look great on the eye. If you're watching him fight, he sometimes he looks like he's gassed when it's early in the fight, and I'm sure he isn't. It's just he has this demeanour about him in the octagon, and early on in his UFC career, he was catching people out because people were being lulled in by him, and because he looks kind of passive in there at times. But he's a big, strong guy, and he can bang. But you just get the impression with Eubank that whether he's actually hitting his full potential, because if you look back at his athletic career, he's very talented all round athlete, and jumping into the UFC and doing as well as he's done. Obviously, he got to the stage where he was challenging John Jones for the interim belt, and I watched that fight live, and even in that fight, I was watching thinking, find another gear and you'll win this fight. Obviously, at the time, I didn't realise that he'd broken his arm. So that obviously gives you some sort of mitigating circumstance for perhaps why he didn't. But it was very similar here. It just didn't seem to want to sort of find that extra gear that allows him to just dominate an opponent and win convincingly. And you know what they say, don't leave it in the hands of the judges. And as Bert Watson used to say, the judges will make you cry every time. And they certainly didn't go OSP's way. That was a big shock. But an even bigger shock came immediately beforehand. We had a heavyweight fight between Anthony Freight Train Hamilton, who is a sizable lump in the UFC's heavyweight division, most recently coming off a defeat where he was brutally kimuraed by Francis Ngannou. But other than that, he's a solid operator in that heavyweight division. I don't think he's going to challenge for a championship anytime soon, but he's one of those where if you can get past him, then you're on the way to better things, And he stepped in there with Marcel Fortuna, who weighed 210 pounds at weigh-in day for a heavyweight fight. So he's only 5 pounds into that heavyweight limit. Hamilton, I think, weighed something like 253 or 256 or something like that. So, and on Fight Night, you can bet Hamilton had bulked up even more. So, we're talking probably around £50 weight differential, which is ridiculous. That's a good couple of weight classes, And Fortuna went in there, and he's got good grappling credentials, and people were thinking maybe he can catch him with a submission. Maybe he can get into the mat and catch him with a submission. And he goes and knocks him out in the most brutal, spectacular way possible. Face plant, walk off, knockout. And no one saw that coming. I mean, this fight card is absolutely littered with upset results, where the so-called pundits, the so-called experts have been humbled somewhat, and I'm certainly no exception. I thought Anthony Hamilton would win that fight relatively comfortably, and Marcel Fortuna just KO'd him in the first round, no less. So unbelievable. And Fortuna immediately said he wants to go back down to light heavyweight. I don't blame him. Because I was watching the fight, I'm like, this can't be legal. How did this get sanctioned? And then he goes and wins by knockout. So what do we know?
Well, I actually had Hamilton down for a first-round KO prediction, and they actually went totally the opposite way. And I think maybe Fortuna's making the right decision here, because he's gone up to heavyweight, he's knocked out a true heavyweight in spectacular fashion, and the fact that he wants to go back to light heavyweight is great, because the light heavyweight needs fighters, needs names, needs prospects to go make their way up the ladder, and I suspect it will be a much easier climb up the ladder for him compared to heavyweight. So yeah, 205 needs him, and he wants to go 205. I think that's a match made in heaven right there.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing what they do with him, because he's immediately building a highlight reel for himself, and obviously that was a knockout, but he's better known for his grappling skills. So that may act as a bit of a curveball and a bit of a spoiler when people are looking to prepare to face him. I'm sure Hamilton was preparing to face a grappler and perhaps didn't pay much mind to Fortuna's striking, and it's backfired in a major way. Now, we hinted at it earlier, and I think this is the fight that probably deserves the most airtime on the show, to be honest with you. Jessica Andrade versus Angela Hill. I don't think this is too far short of being the best female fight we've seen in the UFC. You know, we've seen some great matches in the past. Ioane and Jacek has been involved in a couple of crackers. Claudia Gadelha last year was a good fight. The Karolina Kowalkiewicz fight in New York was a belter as well. But I think this one's right up there. Jessica Andrade against Angela Hill, just a remarkable fight. And Jessica Andrade is now absolutely in pole position to take on the aforementioned strawweight champion of the world, Ioane and Jacek. And that is a fight that has me very, very excited indeed. I think that is, from a stylistic point of view, it can't fail to deliver. It can't fail to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, what Andrade has done now, and she is the official #1 contender for Ioane Jędrzejczyk's title. Dana White made that very clear. She's got a nice little streak put together over some formidable names in the strawweight division. Jessica Penne, Joanne Calderwood, and the Invicta champion. I guess Andrade is now calling herself the unofficial Invicta champion, and she wants to unify the belts.
The linear champion, yeah.
Yeah, by beating Angela Hill. I think she did a really good job on Saturday night, and she's obviously put together a fantastic run of victories here. I still think the jury is out on how she would perform over 5 rounds, and that's going to be the true test when she does face Ioane Jędrzejczyk, who has got a ton of experience now in big, high-profile main event slots over the course of 5 rounds. And I think Ioane making a move from Poland over to Florida, training with ATT, I think she almost kind of foresaw some of the challenges that were creeping around the corner in the division, and I'm sure she's been improving her takedown defense and her overall wrestling ability at AT&T, because we know she's a world-class striker, and she's gonna have to put that to full effect when she does face Jessica Andrade eventually. I mean, Andrade is a pit bull of a fighter. But I'd still pick Ioane Jędrzejczyk in that fight. I just can't. I can never go against an undefeated fighter until they actually suffer their first loss. So right now, I'd definitely favour Ioane, but she's definitely going to have her hands full because Andrade is proving to be the real deal in that women's strawweight division.
Yeah, she's really benefited from moving back down. She was competing at 135 pounds and was ridiculously undersized in that division and was punching above her weight and doing remarkably well, given the size differential. She's now fighting in a more natural weight class for her, and she looks outstanding. The one reason why I completely agree with you, and I think the pick for that title fight will still be Ioane and Jędrzejczyk, is because Angela Hill was still landing clean. She was using her feet very well and countering Jessica Andrade superbly. She was trading with her really well, and from a technical standpoint, Angela Hill was the better striker. She was, in my opinion at least, I think her footwork was better. I think her counter striking was on point. But the difference between the two was Andrade was just relentless. She's got the strength and the power. She was just walking through a lot of what Angela was doing. Now, if you can marry up the sort of skills that Hill has with a little bit more power and perhaps increased output, then you've got yourself a real fight. And I think Ioane and Jędrzejczyk certainly has that. And Ioane likes to push the pace as well. So when you've got someone like Jessica who really likes to get on the front foot and force her opponent back against someone like Ioane who likes to dominate the centre of the octagon and really stalk her opponent around the cage, I think it makes for a fantastic stylistic matchup. And the big question is, where will they put it on? Will we get it in Europe maybe? As a European world champion, would they consider putting on a world championship fight in Europe again? Or will they use it to sort of bolster another show? in the US. All I do know is whenever it is and wherever it is, I want to watch the thing, because that's going to be one hell of a fight. Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Jessica Andrade, strawweight championship of the world, and I think probably the toughest test of Joanna Jędrzejczyk's career so far. That pretty much wraps up most of the sort of the headline stories from UFC Fight Night 104. Other notables to just very quickly touch on and pick out any that stand out to you, Sandhu. I mean, Curtis Blades ragdolled Adam Milstead, who eventually ended up losing via TKO due to a pretty nasty looking knee injury. We hope he's okay and that knee isn't as bad as we all feared it might be on Fight Night. He was incredibly undersized as well. Curtis Blades looking an absolute monster at heavyweight, and it only goes to show just how much of a monster Francis Ngannou is, because Ngannou took Blades to the cleaners when they fought in Zagreb. So that's a really interesting one as well. Blades, I think, could be a rising contender as well. Tisha Torres beat Beck Rawlings pretty convincingly on the scorecards, 30-27 all the way around. Torres is one of the most technically sound fighters in that division, but she just doesn't seem to have the finishing power. It's something that's been levelled against her in the past, but she put on a very, very good, slick display to pick up another win. And the UFC Fight Pass prelims, which aren't getting the shine that they used to get, Sandhu. Now Eric Winter has departed. It feels like the Fight Pass prelims are being relegated back to the sort of the status of the old Facebook prelims, where they are the two lowest fights on the lowest heat fights on the card. But what we did see on Saturday was two notable knockout victories. Khalil Roundtree Jr. Picking up a really, really big knockout win, huge knee, and he needed that after coming off the Ultimate Fighter and looking like he was struggling a little bit. He looked much leaner, much faster, and very relaxed. And almost the first strike he threw was that knee, which brought the knockout. And Nico Price, who we both sat and watched at the Grosvenor Casino in Russell Square, only a few events back, it feels like. I think it might have been UFC 207, and we sat and watched him get a win on his UFC debut. He got another win. He followed it up with another win against Alex Morona, who I thought was winning the fight. And then Price just scored a huge late knockout and got the win. Really, really good performance from those two. That was UFC Fight Night in Houston, Texas. Any other standouts for you, Sandhu?
No, I mean, you pretty much wrapped things up this side. The only thing I wanted to kind of say was, in regards to the Tisha Torres-Beck Rawlings fight, Rawlings, yet another female fighter in the UFC who unfortunately is just too big for the weight class. You know, she struggled to make the 115-pound weight limit. She came in at 117.5 pounds. They ended up making it a catch weight fight. But it's back-to-back losses for Beck Rawlings. But someone like Rawlings and Valerie Letourneau and Joanne Calderwood, I almost got my Joannas mixed up there.
Jojo.
Jojo. That's three names right there who would very much benefit from a flyweight division. And of course, the UFC haven't got one yet. They decided to go for the featherweight weight class instead, which we're going to talk about in our next segment. But it's unfortunate. I mean, I don't know where she goes from here, whether she maybe perhaps goes back to Invicta and gets some fights there, whether she'll get a route back to the UFC like Angela Hill did. Maybe when she does return, there will be a flyweight division. Who knows? But yeah, it's just a little bit unfortunate because she's a character. She's an Aussie, and the UFC do go to Australia. Sometimes once, sometimes twice a year, and she's always somebody that you'd want to have a part of that particular fixture. And if anyone's been following her story, she is a mother and she has sacrificed a hell of a lot. She's a single mother, and she's put a lot of time, effort, energy, and money into her last couple of training camps. And unfortunately for her, she hasn't come up with the victories. So it'll be interesting to see how her career develops from here on end.
Yeah, definitely, and I completely agree about the 125-pound division. I think that really would see some fighters in that strawweight division in particular who perhaps aren't quite fighting to their full capabilities. I think that would then see those fighters really producing the goods. I think it would make for better fights. Obviously, it's healthier. And what it also does is it allows some of those undersized fighters at 135 to look at dropping down. And I think, I just think it's a no-brainer move. We've talked about it before. More divisions means more championship belts, which means more options for headliners and co-headliners across the year. It just gives a bit more stardust to fight cards. But these things take a bit of time to plan and to put together, and fingers crossed we get to see that in the next 12 to 18 months, because it will certainly help people like Beck Rawlings for sure. You talked about the weight class above, or two classes above, in fact, because it's the featherweight division, not the bantamweight division we're talking about next, because that is the main event of UFC 208, which takes place this coming weekend from the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. Holly Holm taking on the Iron Lady, Germaine de Randamie, for the inaugural UFC Women's Featherweight Championship of the World. 145 pounds. Holly Holm, who was always a big bantamweight, is going to be much bigger and stronger and more comfortable at that weight class. Germaine de Randamie's quite tall for bantamweight as well, so she will obviously have appreciated the ability to move up as well. Two strikers, but very different, Sandhu.
Yeah, and I think this is a very interesting fight because in a perfect world, we would have seen Cyborg in this inaugural featherweight title fight for the UFC. And prior to her USADA violation, it was a lot of posturing, a lot of back and forth, and when the fight would take place, and who knows what else was going on behind the scenes. But eventually, the UFC and Chris Cyborg couldn't come to terms. And thank God they couldn't come to terms, because had they booked that fight and started to put the promotional hustle and muscle behind it, and then she got flagged by USADA, that would have been a much bigger disaster. But what they've got here is someone in Holly Holm who is a proven draw, coming off the back of that historic obliteration of Ronda Rousey, going back about 14, 15 months now to November of 2015. And although since then she's had a couple of losses, she hasn't really lost too much of her appeal or star power, I don't think. I still think outside of your Misha Tates and your Ronda Rousey, she's right up there as the next kind of well-known female fighter, especially when it comes to mainstream media outlets and getting that attention. So, and I think this would be quite the test to see how a couple of losses would affect her drawing power, headlining a show. And it'll be interesting to see how Fight Week plays out this week and what kind of media attention she gets. And in regards to Germaine de Randamie, she's flying the Dutch flag, she's flying the flag for all of Europe, and it's fantastic to see yet another European get into a title fight in the UFC. And if she wins, that'll be the fourth one. We've got Conor, we've got Joanna Jędrzejczyk, we've got Michael Bisping. Germaine de Randamie would be the fourth European to have a UFC championship, which is great for the sport and for the UFC's brand on this side of the world, and it just helps everyone in the entire industry. I'm sure our friends in the Netherlands who cover the sport, the interest that they're going to want to get, and the coverage that they're going to want to get, and I'm sure maybe the bigger mainstream outlets who aren't covering MMA will be approaching them because they're the experts on MMA. So these things can really impact how the sport develops in their native country. We saw what Conor did for MMA in Ireland. We've seen what Michael Bisping, even well before he became a champion, has done over many years here in the UK. And of course, Joanna Jędrzejczyk's an absolute superstar in Poland. So it's a very interesting fight. I'm kind of, at first when it was initially booked, it didn't really kind of get my juices going. But now we're going to start to see how things develop in Fight Week. I'd really like to see Germaine de Randamie's story told a little bit more, and hopefully in the various interviews that she conducts herself in this week, we'll get to see her peel the onion a little bit more, and we'll see how things eventually develop. But in terms of the actual fight itself, I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be action packed. Like you said, Simon, they come from different striking disciplines and backgrounds, but they are, world champions in their own right in those striking combat sport arenas, and I'm sure they'll be kind of bringing those skills to the fore come Saturday night.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We've got different striking styles, more traditional boxing mixed up with a few kicks against someone who is a seasoned Muay Thai world champion. At one stage, I think she went on a 37 fight win streak, which is just ridiculous. And the thing with Germaine Randamie, you talked about the media interest, and a friend of ours, Giovanni Chin, who runs the Epic MMA outlet over there in Holland, he tweeted earlier today actually saying it was great to see how much mainstream media interest there is over in the Netherlands for Germaine Randamie in this upcoming fight. So encouraging sounds coming from our friend Gio, that the sport is beginning to get a bit more shine over there. Traditionally a kickboxing country, of course, when it comes to combat sports. MMA is gradually beginning to make inroads, and obviously the event in Rotterdam last year was a huge hit. The event itself was awesome. The crowd reaction was incredible, and the biggest crowd reaction of the night was for Germaine Randamie. Alistair Overeem was in the main event. Germaine Randamie got the biggest ovation. That was noticeable, but she's taken a major step up in opposition. She beat Anna Elmos in that fight, and she's now taking on Holly Holm for a world championship. She'll be fired up for this one. I'm looking forward to that. It's interesting for Holly. She's on a 2-fight losing streak, so she's going to be pretty motivated with or without a gold strap at the end of the rainbow. She's just got to go in there and win for the sake of her own career and her own selling power as a top level UFC fighter. You start to lose 3 in a row, then there's question marks already there, I suppose, but now there really are. Because the two fights that she's lost, this is different now. She's going into this as a huge favourite, I think, against Germaine Randamie, or at least I would assume she's going to be a huge favourite. And this is a fight that I don't think she can afford to lose. So I'm looking forward to that. That is a co-main event. Oh, sorry, the main event. We don't know the full fight card in terms of the placement yet, I don't think, but I would assume the co-main event is going to be formed by Anderson Silva and Derek Brunson. Middleweight fight, technique versus power. Can Anderson Silva roll back the years and score another spectacular knockout victory? Well, Derek Brunson likes to wave his chin around quite a lot, so you never know, it's possible. But the thing with Brunson is he does just blitz, attack people, and if Anderson Silva isn't on his game, he could get eaten up. So interesting, because Brunson's been very gung-ho. It counted against him against Robert Whittaker last time out. Will it count against him against Anderson Silva this time? I'm looking forward to this. And just to see what else Anderson Silva's got left in the tank, Sandhu.
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? I mean, Robert Whittaker, like you said, he's... Derek Brunson coming off that Robert Whittaker loss, and Anderson Silva in his last 5 fights, he's lost 4 of them, and one was a no contest against Nick Diaz. You have to go back to October of 2012 to find his last registered victory, which was over Stefan Bonner. Still remember that vicious knee to the body and the following punches that ended that particular fight. I don't know what we're going to get with Anderson Silva, Simon. I guess that's always a thing with him, isn't it? You just never know what you're going to get. Life is like a box of chocolates, as the famous quote goes from Forrest Gump. And he's over 40 professional fights, Simon. The guy's 41. He's got nothing to prove. I mean, his legacy is 100% cemented, but he's already talking about, making another potential title run. He's already kind of having a few jabs at Bisping, trying to get that rematch. But I think what he needs to do is just get a couple of wins together. That's what he needs to do. He needs to go back to some fundamentals, get a few wins put together. And I think if I'm the UFC, I'm matchmaking Anderson very carefully this year. There is definitely a lack of star power and drawing power. I think you can definitely build Anderson back up to that godlike figure he once was, again, if you matchmake him in the correct way. And I'm sure, he's somebody that can jump around weight classes. He's fought at light heavyweight before. He's obviously, fought at middleweight before. And it's very interesting to actually. I was noticing some of the YouTube figures. So the UFC, they always release their countdown show in 3 parts on YouTube. They release the show in its entirety as well, but they'll normally release the top 3 fights, which in this case is Holm versus Randamie, Anderson Silva, Derek Brunson, and Jacare versus Tim Boetsch. And actually, it's Silva versus Brunson that's got the most views out of all of them, which tells you exactly what you need to know in terms of Anderson Silva and his drawing power. And I still think the mythos and the interest lies in what's going on in his life. Are we going to see the old Anderson? Is there still enough magic left in that bottle? And I guess that's what the intrigue is here coming into Saturday night. He needs a win, Simon. I mean, if he suffers yet another loss, I mean, as famous as a star, as a bigger star that he is for the UFC, losing 5 fights. I mean, what do you do with that in the UFC? You know?
Yeah, no, you're dead right. I think, and you know, we've spoken about the light heavyweight division needing some star power. Then I don't think it's a ridiculous suggestion to pitch him in there. The thing is, once you get to some of those guys at the top of the, there's some big lads in that light heavyweight division. Silver's a big middleweight, but at light heavyweight, he certainly won't be. He certainly won't be the biggest dog in that in that division. So it's an interesting, especially at the age of 41 as well, being hit by some big heavy guys. He might not fancy that now at this stage of his career, but I thought we should have moved up there ages ago, to be honest. But he's got Derek Brunson here. This is really sort of sink or swim territory for both guys, really. I mean, Brunson needs a marquee win to keep him in the conversation. He had a big opportunity against Robert Whittaker, and from a tactical point of view, fought terribly and got punished for it. And now he's got the gift, if you like, of a fight with an all-time great who, you know, yeah, he's on a losing streak. He's on a losing streak, but the people he's lost to are world champions.
Yeah.
So if Derek Brunson can put him away, then that obviously, you know, he gets a bit of shine off that. So if he can get himself a stoppage win over the Spider, then all of a sudden that gives him the ability to then push on himself. So really interested to see what happens there. Anderson Silva obviously gunning for a middleweight title shot. If he's going to get one, A, he's going to have to beat Derek Brunson, and B, he's going to have to elbow out of the way a good friend of his who is also fighting on this card. And you just mentioned him, Ronaldo Jacare Souza, who is taking on the barbarian Tim Boetsch. This was a fight that raised a lot of eyebrows when it was announced on social media. I get it. I completely understand, A, why the fight was made, and B, why all the eyebrows were raised as well. The eyebrows are raised because why is Jacare fighting Tim Boetsch? Why is he not fighting a higher ranked guy? Why is he not fighting for the belt or a #1 contender fight? Those fights are tied up. Those fights are either tied up or the fighters involved are injured. I mean, Luke Rockhold being injured doesn't help. Chris Weidman's currently serving a medical suspension right now, I believe, after the Yoel Romero fight. So,
well, Weidman's booked against Musashi, isn't he?
He is, but I believe he's on suspension, or he might have just come off suspension. So I don't think they could have booked him on this. So I think with that in mind, Jacare Souza, they didn't have an enormous amount of options for him, and they would have needed someone who would have been at least a credible opponent. But by the same token, it's also an opponent that you would expect Jacare to deal with. And I think Tim Boetsch kind of fits that. Boetsch, on his day, is very, very dangerous, and he showed it in New York at Madison Square Garden with an incredible performance, big knockout in Madison Square Garden. But he's got Jacare this time, and Jacare is as dangerous as they come at middleweight. Probably the best fighter in that division who hasn't had a title shot yet. And I think this is the UFC putting him on a holding pattern. I think if it's a case of beat Tim Boetsch, stay in the conversation, then you're next. That would be my take on the situation. But obviously you can't be looking past, you know, Tim Boetsch. You just have to look at his win in New York to see you cannot sleep on this guy, because if you do, you'll be the ones doing the sleeping. You'll be out on the canvas. So interesting fight, but it's an obstacle that Jacare needs to overcome.
Yeah, I think it's just a fight that keeps him busy, like you said, Simon. Keeps him active, and keeps him in the public limelight. Keeps him ticking along in that division. Like you said, the title fight is totally wrapped up and tied up at the moment. It'll be Romero's fight against Michael Bisping. Weidman's tied up with Masasi. Luke Rockhold's injured, like you said. And what I would love to see Jacare do, if he wins, of course, is get on that microphone and make some bloody noise. I think, I think he kind of almost feels like he's become a little bit of a victim with the current structure of the UFC, because based on meritocracy alone, he should have received a title shot a while ago.
Yep.
Right? But that's just not the way the world works in the UFC. This is the fight game. It's the hype game. It's a sport for entertainment. So, and I think you may need to take a little leaf out of Yoel Romero's book, who did a fantastic job in New York, both in his performance against Weidman, but also on the microphone. So, if things go well for Jacare, I hope and I would like to see him take a full advantage of the post-fight interview. But Tim Boetsch is there to play the spoiler, and if anyone can do it, it is Tim Boetsch. On any given day, he can definitely spark your lights out 100%. And wouldn't that be something if he can get a win over Jacare, and then he gets on the microphone and maybe calls out the winner of Weidman Masasi, or maybe says, "Hey, Luke Rockhold, when you're back from injury, I'll be waiting for you," something like that. And all of a sudden, he's going to be inserting himself into that top 4, top 5 picture. So it's a tasty fight, but I definitely 100% certainly expect Jacare to come out the victor here.
Yeah, I think most people do. I think, as I say, it's going to be a tricky obstacle for him to overcome, but one that I think the overwhelming majority of us are going to expect him to accomplish. 2 other fights on this fight card. I assume they're both going to be on the main card. It's possible one of them might end up headlining the prelims. Glover Teixeira versus Jared Cannonier, and Dustin Poirier versus Jim Miller. I think the fight of the night is going to come from one of these two. Glover Teixeira loves to stand and trade. It didn't go his way against Anthony Rumble Johnson, as we all know. Jared Cannonier has really started to establish himself as a real threat at 205 pounds. Put on a barn burner of a fight against Ion Cutelaba last time. Cutelaba, not the most well-known name. You'll know who he is because he weighed in dressed full body paint like the Incredible Hulk. And Jared Cannonier put on a great fight with him. Scored a big knockout in his previous outing as well. I think we're going to see 2 big, strong 205ers going head-to-head and just throwing leather. And it could turn into being a bit of a classic. And the fight that, if I was putting money down on a fight of the night, Dustin Poirier versus Jim Miller at 155, it just seems ready-made as a night opener on the main card, or maybe the top of the prelims. Jim Miller always brings it. Dustin Poirier, one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. That's going to be an outstanding matchup. If you were putting your money down on Poirier and Miller, who would you be betting on, Sandhu?
I think Miller's having a little bit of a late career resurgence at the moment, and it all goes back to UFC 200 last summer, when he got a fantastic victory over Takanori Gomi. He followed that up with another emphatic, well, actually it wasn't emphatic, it was a bit of a split decision. It could have gone either way against Joe Lozon. But an emphatic win over Thiago Alves followed that at UFC 205. He's got a knack of always popping up at some of these big marquee blockbuster events, does old Jim Miller. And I think, listen, if he gets a win over Dustin Poirier, and I think we've all kind of said this in the past, Poirier is a much, much better fighter at lightweight than he was at featherweight. It's definitely the right weight class for him. Things didn't go his way last September when he fought Michael Johnson. He got knocked out there. But I fancy Jim Miller here, Si. Like I said, I think he's got this late career resurgence. He's pretty much well-rounded, good everywhere. And he's coming off 3 back-to-back wins, and he must be oozing confidence at the moment. But yeah, if you're going to put some money down on a fight of the night, that is definitely the scrap to put it down on.
Definitely. Well, I'm going to go opposite you on this one, because I'm picking Dustin Poirier to win this. I've always been a big admirer of the way he goes about his work in the octagon. He's got that level of intensity that you want to see from from a UFC star, and I think he's one of those. He's just a gnat below championship contention. You know, he's come close on a couple of occasions, and it's just not quite worked for him, both at featherweight and now obviously with that fight at lightweight where he got stopped by Michael Johnson in a fight that a lot of people, myself included, were picking Poirier to win. And I think the thinking then was if he got past him, then he really was right up there in the mix. And I know even back then he was talking about if Conor McGregor joins the division, he wants a rematch and all this sort of stuff. So that obviously has gone by the wayside somewhat. But yeah, I think that's going to be an outstanding match. UFC 208, Holm versus the Randamie, Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. That should be a slightly earlier start than usual for us Brits, fingers crossed, but it'd be an East Coast card. So we'll put the broadcast times out on our social media at some point, I'm sure. Make sure you follow at Sandhu MMA and at Simon Head. I'm sure one or both of us will be putting that information out between now and Fight Night. That was our preview of what's coming up this weekend. This isn't going to be a 2-hour epic this week, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, because it's Q&A time, Mr. Sandhu. I put out a call for questions this afternoon. You put out a call for questions, I think, earlier this morning, and we've had a few. So let's see if we can rattle through them and get as many of them answered as we can before it's time to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get right to it. Stuart Tuckwell tweets in and says, with a lack of big names on the pay-per-view events at the moment, was it a mistake to have Dillashaw and Garbrandt doing The Ultimate Fighter? I can see where he's coming from. I can definitely see where he's coming from. And I think we'll both agree that we would much rather see this fight sooner rather than later. But I can understand it from the UFC perspective. They need to fill these tough seasons. They do 2 a year. They try and get coaches that have a rivalry, have some beef, so that it kind of almost is providing a compelling story over the course of the 8, 10, 12 episodes, and almost gives the season some sort of narrative and arc heading into their fight sometime in the summer. So I understand exactly where Stuart is coming from. But I also, like I said, I think you need, and I think it's actually for the first time in a long time, I think this particular rivalry is perfectly made for the show. I think with the Uriah Faber factor and the Dwayne Ludwig factor, all of these elements being available in the cast for the show as the head coaches, it's got all the elements of a combustible situation there. And if you're into the reality TV show and the drama that comes along with it, I'm sure there'll be plenty of that over the course of the season, Si.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is the Ultimate Fighter. It's not there's no secret. It's kind of on its last legs now as a format. It's been going for a long time now, and it's beginning to get a bit tired. And in order to keep interest levels up, the UFC need to do something with it. Obviously, they tried to do a World Championship elimination tournament with the straw weights when they introduced that. They did a tournament again to earn a shot at Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson most recently. But now, obviously, they're going back to the fact that we've got a fight here. It's a World Championship fight. It's going to happen at the end of it between the two coaches. The two coaches have got some previous, having trained together. I think Justin Buchholz recently said that he has video footage of Cody Garbrandt knocking TJ Dillashaw out in sparring. Whether we'll get to see that at some point during the season, I wonder. There's rivalry already there. Everything is in place, and what it does is I think it just adds another compelling strand to a show that really needs a bit of heat put under it. So I'm certainly looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to the whole comeback element to it as well, with the welterweight fighters who have had a go at tough before, including one current UFC welterweight. They're all going to be back in the mix. So we're going to see some familiar faces, hopefully. And that hopefully will make it a little bit more watchable and a bit more compelling. But I wouldn't mind seeing that title fight in a couple of weeks' time, to be honest with you. But I understand why they've done it.
Paul James tweets in and says, out of the British fighters, who has the best chance of being our next champion? You can go for that one first, Si.
Well, are we talking just in the UFC, or are we talking Bellator? Because if you're talking Bellator, then Michael Venom Page and Paul Daley are both probably one big win, possibly against the other one, away from a shot at the Bellator world title. MVP, if you're talking about star power, MVP for me stands head and shoulders above everybody from the UK. He's got the it factor. I would love to see him on the biggest stage possible, fighting for world championships. And I don't think it'll be that long before we see him given the opportunity. So if you're talking Bellator, then I think it's him and or Paul Daley. If we're talking about the UFC, it gets a bit trickier because I think the British guys who are in the UFC right now, they're either at veteran stage, or we've got guys who are relatively young and are still looking to make their way up. So you've got people like Arnold Allen, who I think has got a lot of upside. Martin Diakiese has got a lot of upside. Can they work their way up to world championship level? I think there's a long way for them to go before they get there. But they're on that road. Jimmy the Poster Boy Manoa is in a decent spot in that UFC light heavyweight division. He's got a huge knockout win in his last fight against Ovin St. Preux. He's fighting Corey Anderson in the main event in London. If he can repeat the trick against him, all of a sudden he becomes a potential championship contender. But he's in a relatively thin division, but the guys at the sharp end are among the best anywhere in any weight class. Anthony Rumble Johnson, Daniel Cormier, John Jones. So that's a tough trio to sort of break through and become a world champion. So it's kind of tricky. If you want a bit of a left field suggestion, then keep an eye on Paddy Pimblett, because he's not in the UFC yet, but he's young, he's talented. He's got a little bit of that stardust, about him when it comes to crowd following, and if he gets in the UFC and gets a bit of momentum behind him, you never know. He might be the guy. So it's tough right now because of the sort of where everybody is in their career. There isn't an obvious pick, I don't think, when it comes to the UFC.
Yeah, and I completely concur with everything you said there, Simon. There's no need for me to regurgitate anything, but you pretty much hit the nail on the head. The only other person that I probably wanted to throw in the hat there is Tom Breeze. Tom Breeze is making his middleweight debut in London against Oluwale Bambose, a really tough competitor at the middleweight division. It'll be interesting to see Breeze's performance, having now that he doesn't have to cut the extra weight. He should be firing on all cylinders, be very healthy, and be able to be as explosive as he can be for the full 15 minutes. So that's just another name that I wanted to throw into the hat there. But a lot of potential prospects within the British contingent, both in Bellator and the UFC. And like you said, Simon, you've got Jimmy Manuwa. He's the guy that's most further afield in terms of rankings, in terms of fighting in a main event for the UFC. So I think that pretty much covers everyone. Raz tweets in and says, "Is it time the UFC bring back Paul Daley and look at signing MVP?" I think it's a little tricky at the moment. I think there perhaps was a period of time where Dana White was in conversation with Paul Daley to potentially bring him back, and it didn't transpire. And now he's with Bellator, he's in his mid-30s. I can see him seeing out the rest of his pro MMA days with Scott Coker, a promoter he likes to work for and likes to work with. And I think the way they've kind of put the promotional hustle and muscle behind him, I think he likes that. And I think he's a star in their welterweight division. He's definitely someone that can main event shows like he did last summer here in London. MVP, he's a little younger than Paul Daley, but not too much younger. He's 31, Daley's 33. And every time I speak to Michael about this, and I don't know, maybe Simon, you probably had a similar experience, he just likes the way Bellator do things. He likes the promotion. He likes the big stage and the big ramp. He likes to be able to wear whatever sponsors he wants to. He likes to have his own. I mean, his actual walkout song is a song that him and his friends have put together. He likes to put all the bells and whistles. I can't see him, walk in just a very uniform Reebok attire for the UFC. At the same time, he's always dropping a few hints here and there, saying he wants to fight the best in the world and he wants to be recognized as one of the best in the world. And for most people, that does mean fighting in the UFC and winning a UFC championship belt. Again, I go back to something I mentioned earlier on. The UFC, they are trimming the fat at the moment. At the moment, it's still a transitional period where not only are they letting executives go, they're letting fighters go. They're letting fighters see out their contracts and not re-signing them, or just giving them their best offer, and not being able to match perhaps what Bellator are providing. Case in point being Ryan Bader. I've got a funny feeling that I think Michael Venom Page is going to end up being Bellator's poster boy for the foreseeable future. I think they're not going to want to let go of him, even when his contract expires. I think he could potentially, for the long term, be one of the most highest paid fighters under the Bellator roster, considering how much effort and time they've already put into him. If you go to the Bellator YouTube page, the Cyborg Santos knockout and Pokemon style celebration is their number one viewed video on YouTube. And I'm saying number one viewed by a good few million. So he's definitely got his finger on the pulse when it comes to social media. They've had him fly over to LA quite a few times and do some bits and pieces over the overall Viacom umbrella, where there are some other media opportunities. So of course, would we like to see these Brits fight on the bigger stage in the UFC and be able to, fantasy match make them against some of the best welterweight talent in the UFC? Of course. But don't forget, Rory McDonald is now signed with Bellator, right? So slowly but surely, depending on who becomes available in the free agency market, we may finally start to see some of these fantasy fights within the Bellator promotion. So that's my long-winded answer. Sorry, Simon, to take up too much time there. But to the question, I mean, again, just to kind of get your thoughts on this too. Would you like to see the UFC bring back Paul Daley and MVP? And do you think it's likely?
Well, the answer to the first question, yeah, of course I would. I think having both those guys fighting on the biggest stage in the sport, I think would be great. Do I think it will happen? No, I don't. I think for all the reasons you've just explained there, with MVP. The guy's a showman. He's a showman, and the one thing with the way the UFC is set up at the moment, it isn't really geared up if you want to be a showman. Conor McGregor breaks the mold and gets away with it, but even he has to walk to the octagon at a prescribed time, in a pre-approved set of kit, Yeah, I think MVP. He's a bit of a throwback to sort of some of the Hector Macho Camacho for any old school boxing fans. Look him up. People like him, De La Hoya back in the day, where these guys were superstars, and when they emerged from the tunnel or walked down the ramp, they look like superstars, and they all had their own swag going on, and MVP is one of those, and I think it's the one thing that I think I'd love to see the UFC change, and obviously they're contractually tied in some respects, but that individuality is the one thing that the UFC could really do with bringing back. But at the moment, Bellator I think is a perfect place for Michael Venom Page at this point in his career. The other thing, of course, is I'm sure he has a matching clause in his contract. So, and Bellator, I don't think they're shy of cash. So, even if he allowed his contract to run, tested free agency, and got a stupendous offer from the UFC, I could still see a scenario where he remained with Bellator as their highest paid star, with all the creative control that he wanted over his own brand, and being able to be MVP, not just Michael Page from London, but to be MVP. I think having that freedom, I think, suits him. If he were to clean out the Bellator welterweight division, if he were to go in there, blitz Koreshkov, destroy Rory McDonald, and basically have no more challenges left to conquer, then I think we're into a different conversation. But right now, I think Bellator's a good spot for him.
Paul Collins tweets in and says, question, is Jimmy versus Corey big enough for London main event? I feel Jimmy is, but Corey isn't. Well, look, we went and we discussed this to death on last week's episode, I think me and Simon made our feelings quite clear on the matter. But just to kind of quickly go over it one more time, just to answer the question. Jimmy, 100%. He's been there before. He's a Londoner. He's been in the main event, and like I said, I think, and if I'm the UFC, this is the way I'm building it. You've got to build around the story of this being a redemption situation for Jimmy. He fought in the main event before against Alexander Gustafsson. It didn't go his way. This is his second chance to perform in front of his friends and family and fellow Londoners in a main event spotlight. He's ranked number 5. This could potentially propel him into a title shot. That's the promotional angle. I haven't seen that yet, but they've got some time. They've got some time to hopefully tell that story. With Corey Anderson, I perhaps do agree with Paul here. I don't think he's in that main event kind of picture just yet to main event or headline shows. But considering where we currently are, with the number of events that we have and with the available talent that the UFC has to pick from, sometimes you will get opportunities. Case in point, Germaine Randamie getting a title shot after just a few fights in the UFC in a brand new weight class. Sometimes opportunity knocks, and for Corey Anderson, opportunity is knocking big time here, getting a main event slot against Emmanuel in London. He has the opportunity to play the spoiler, and for him, he has to really take this opportunity to again express his personality, level up a little bit more, both in and out of the octagon. So I don't think there's too much more that could be potentially said about the situation, Simon. I don't know how much more you want to add to that, considering we already spoke about it last week. But have your feelings changed? Do you have anything perhaps more to add regarding that particular main event and the two fighters involved?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the only things I would say are, I think the fight was made thinking it would be a co-main event. I think if they were told, put Jimmy Manuwa in the main event, they maybe would have wanted a slightly different opponent, maybe a Shogun Hua or someone like that, who has perhaps a little bit more star power. Although Corey Anderson is probably going to be a bigger test. So I just think Corey Anderson, while being an incredibly dangerous contender, someone who's rising up the ranks, he hasn't got that star power that excites people yet. And his fighting style is very much of that ilk as well. He's more of a grinding wrestler than someone who's going to stand there and trade shots. And of course, we are a boxing savvy nation. Our combat sport of choice historically has been boxing. So the stand-up element of MMA is where people really get switched on the most. So if you've now got boxer versus wrestler, which is effectively what you have if you're breaking the styles down to brass tacks, then it just makes it a little bit less appealing for your casual mixed martial arts fan. And for those hardcore fans, they were obviously hoping for a slightly higher grade main event. Jimmy against a bigger, higher ranked opponent, I'm sure would have made them happy. So, but yeah, one thing I did mention last week, I suggested that the UFC go out, talk to UC MMA and get some old school fight footage, and lo and behold, the UFC on social media, and a big thank you to Dan Barnes, who tweeted me this week to say, "Sire, they must listen to the show. Look what they've made." And he tweeted me the promo video that the UFC have made of Jimmy Manuwa, and sure enough, the first portion of the video is Manuwa just destroying people under the Ultimate Challenge MMA banner that really built him and built his name before he eventually moved up to the UFC. So maybe they do listen to us, Sandhu. Who knows? We should start matchmaking a bit more often. Maybe
we should create a brand new segment moving forward and see what eventually develops down the road.
Yeah.
Right. So Ross, I might butcher this, Finlayson. Ross Finlayson.
Finlayson, yeah.
Finlayson tweets in and says, "Do you think?" Oh, no, sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Sorry, before that, I need to get Amir's question in. Amir says, thoughts on Bellator trying to make Semtex versus MVP for their London card? In brackets, he says, a main event UK fans deserve. Would we like to see it? You damn right we would. Are they trying to make the fight? Yes, they are. I spoke to Bellator PR staff over the weekend, and it is a fight that they were trying to make, and they put a few feelers out. No contracts were issued, despite what you may see on social media. Despite what reports other people may have read from a few other sites, it's not the case whatsoever. MVP versus Paul Daley is not happening in London this May. The promotion are bringing an event to London this May. It's going to be held at the SSE Arena in Wembley, which I think is the right move for them. I think the O2 last summer was a little bit too ambitious. I say that, but unfortunately, we don't know how things might have gone with Kimbo Slice in the original main event, and we don't know how much of a draw, how much pulling power he may have been able to, provide the promotion being in London, and the fact that he passed away before that, we'll just never know. But I think for the second outing, I think the SSC in Wembley is the ideal arena, and I think with the right fights, they could very well sell that out. Now, I spoke to Paul Daley on Sunday morning, and he flat out denied the fact that he was fighting Michael Venom Page in London. Can things change? Of course they can. I think it's just down to a little bit of posturing. I think it's down to money. Daley has since gone on his Facebook, his official Facebook page, and mentioned that he has a fight in place now, and in his words described the opponent as a blood and guts type of warrior, which immediately makes you think of somebody like a Koreshkov, or who knows, maybe even a Rory McDonald. Paul Daley did call out Rory McDonald after his win against Brennan Ward. So the fact that this fight might take place, or the card in London might take place in May, that could work well for Rory McDonald's supposed time frame for his debut. He was actually supposed to fight in London for the UFC not too long ago, and he actually said that he would love to fight in London one day, so that might tick one of his boxes. And to get a first fight, just to kind of get his feet wet again against a big marquee name like Paul Daley, might just set him up nicely for a future title shot. But in regards to the actual fight itself, Simon, what a fantastic fight that can be and what could be, and I think one day will be, with two of the best of Britain's talent on display, Michael Venom Page and Paul Daley. What are your thoughts on Bellator hopefully trying to get that one done somewhere down the road?
I'd love to see it, and I'd love to see it on these shores as well. I think it would be a wasted opportunity to have it anywhere else. I think to have two British guys competing at the highest level, going head to head in a main event of a major mixed martial arts promotion on home soil, I think would be awesome. It's something we haven't really seen before in the UK. So obviously the domestic promotions have put on some big shows in the past. But in terms of world championship level, we haven't seen it. So, or sort of global level events, then we haven't seen it. So that would be fantastic to see. I think the important thing, if you did it, would be to give it a run up. I think you really do need to announce it early and sell the story and just tell that story constantly over a 2-3 month period, and then hold the event. And I think it would be an absolute home run for Bellator, especially if you put other entertaining fights on the card. I think maybe to be honest, now is probably the time to do the fight, because either one of them could find themselves in there with a top contender, and such is the nature of this sport. Things don't always go according to plan. Michael Venom Page's last performance wasn't what people expected from him. Paul Daley, when he fought in London, it didn't go his way. So, all these things you have to bear in mind. Sometimes you have to strike when the iron's hot. I'd be delighted if they did make that fight for London. I think Rory versus Daley makes more sense to Bellator as a whole, because what you're doing is, if Rory loses, it's his first fight, then it doesn't completely damage him. If Daley loses, they still have a strong British contender in the division, and Daley's bounced back before as well. So I think it makes sense to do it from a promotional standpoint. But as a Brit, of course, I'd love to see Daley versus Michael Venom Page. I think that would be outstanding. It'd be like the Benn Eubank of British mixed martial arts. I think it would be awesome.
Yeah, it'd be a civil war or a turf war, the Battle of Britain. Ross Finlayson says, do you think Andrade is the one to dethrone Joanna based on what we've seen of her at 115 so far? I kind of mentioned this earlier on in the show. I'm picking Joanna to win that fight. I think the five round fight experience that she's got, it will pay dividends for her in the actual contest. I think Andrade is quite a muscular fighter, and it'll be interesting to see how her body holds up with the lactic acid building up over the course of 25 minutes. And I think Joanna Jędrzejczyk has proven time and time again she's got the gas tank to go the full 25 at a very high level. And also I think, Andrade has fought in some big shows, but in the main event against Joanna Jędrzejczyk is a whole other level. Joanna's now fought in Madison Square Garden, for God's sakes. But I guess to spin the question a little bit around to you, Simon, if Andrade is going to get it done, what is going to be her keys to victory, do you think?
I think if she gets it done early by overwhelming Joanna with heavy shots. I guess she could do it on the mat with jiu-jitsu, but I don't think that's the way she goes about her business. I think she could potentially catch Joanna cold, I suppose, blitz her early on and just back her up against the fence and hit her with some heavy stuff and hurt her early. Carolina caught Joanna when they fought, but it was weird because Carolina landed a great shot but then stood back, whereas what she needed to do was really pour it on, and she didn't really do it. I think if Jessica Andrade sees any blood in the water, smells any blood in the water, she's going to be all over Joanna Jędrzejczyk. So I think that's going to be the main thing. It's kind of like the Mike Tyson thing, isn't it? It's the earlier in the fight is where the greatest danger is, and I think we've seen Joanna Jędrzejczyk's fights in the past. She sometimes doesn't start the quickest. She tends to build her way into fights, and she really, you look at the Claudia Gadelha fight. Claudia had the better of the opening couple of rounds, and then Joanna found her second wind, and then started to pull away. Obviously, broke back the deficit, and then went on and won the fight down the stretch. I think against someone like Jessica Andrade, the danger isn't so much about losing rounds early. I think it's about getting hurt early because she's such a destructive striker. So I think that's it. Just don't get caught early. If she doesn't get caught early, I fancy Joanna to cruise to a decision or maybe a late stoppage.
Riot, aka Rio T, tweets in and says, "Why are fans getting pissed at the UFC card and main event in England, yet same people are hyped over Daley versus MVP?" Well, look, we've already discussed the fact that Daley versus MVP isn't going to happen, barring an absolute miracle in some behind-the-scenes negotiation tactics on behalf of Paul Daley. Look, I think at the end of the day, there might be a lot of fans out there that might feel a little bit burnt by the UFC here, that may have already bought tickets, not knowing in advance what the actual main event was going to be, thinking that there was still, like Anderson Silva versus Michael Bisping, a main event to be announced in the coming days and weeks, and they put their kind of loyalty into the UFC brand rather than an actual main event. Whereas I think with Bellator, their brand just isn't as powerful or as strong as the UFC. So they need to, and they have to, put their top billing headline act in the forefront to get those tickets sold. So it's a different model in 2017 where we currently are in the MMA world with regards to brand awareness and brand recognition when it comes to the UFC and to Bellator. But yeah, I'm sure, Simon, you've had your timeline filled with some disgruntled British MMA fans who perhaps have bought UFC tickets for the London card. And it remains to be seen, what Bellator put together for this May show. You and me will both be there on Thursday. They've got a press conference. And who knows, maybe we'll do a special podcast there, or maybe we'll just recap it next Monday. But what I do know is that they are thinking about bringing some of their biggest stars for that press conference. I mean, last summer, Simon, you remember, you were there. They had Lennox Lewis there. They had all their big hitters there. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, what's your take on the overall fan reaction to the UFC London card and potentially what Bellator might be bringing to the table this year as well for the UK?
Well, I think if you asked the question about Daley versus Page, if we suspend disbelief for a second and if we just work on the basis that that fight is actually going to happen in London, let's just assume for a minute that it is. That's a battle between two British guys, two British stars who have strong fan bases. That is immediately a completely different kettle of fish to Jimmy Manuwa versus Corey Anderson. Because Jimmy Manuwa is a British fighter with a strong fan base. Corey Anderson isn't. And he's not that exciting a fighter either, if we're being brutally honest. He's good. He's very, very good. But he's not a seat filler. He might be in his hometown, but in London, nah, he's not. The reaction on social media tells you that. That's not a disrespectful thing to say. It's just truth, right? It's just the way it is. Now, so there's that. But where the difference here is, people are just looking at the top line of the fight card. You might have Paul Daley versus Michael Venom Page, but the fights underneath, the fans who are coming might not be able to pick most of them out of a lineup, because Bellator is a growing, developing brand. They're a growing, developing promotion, and they're hosting a lot of up-and-coming talent who, in the main, haven't competed on this side of the pond and haven't competed on live television on this on British live television. So even the names on the undercard aren't going to be known that well. Whereas the UFC in London have stacked the card with names that British fight fans will know, names that British fight fans have paid money to watch at some point, and names that people have been cheering on the telly because they're fighting on BT Sport on a regular basis. So it's the business models are different. The position of the two brands is completely different. If you're looking at it just main event versus main event, fine. But look at the overall product. You buy a ticket to go to an event. If you're buying it purely on the basis of the main event, then good luck to you, right? But you're missing it. You're missing the point if that's the case. The main event sells the most tickets in the main, but there's a whole lot more beneath, to watch and enjoy. So I think what the UFC have done, they've put together a very strong card full of British talent, and it hasn't quite got that main event that people were hoping for. If Bellator were to put on Michael Venom Page versus Paul Daley, people will be doing cartwheels in the street because it's a great fight. Everyone will be excited for it. Will they be excited for the co-main event or the third event or the the preliminaries? It's apples and oranges, mate. I think if you're an MMA fan and you're really, really into it and you can see it for what it is, I think you can spot the difference between the two, and there's stuff to enjoy on both sides. So, yeah, that's why I think British fans are sometimes the criticism is a little misplaced, because you look at what else could be put on in its place, and it isn't normally better.
Sunny Danjal gives us the final question for this week's show, and it's another Bellator-related question, a sign of the times, perhaps. And it's a bit of a follow-on from the last question. He says, Bellator have a chance of giving us a more star-packed card than the UFC. What do you reckon? I might just rephrase this question a little bit. I think now, with the talent that Bellator have, like for like on any given Friday or Saturday, whatever the day of the week you want to put your card on, they've got enough star power now to rival some of the best athletes and the stars in terms of drawing power that the UFC have. I mean, if you look at what UFC have got right now in their roster, Fedor Emelianenko, Chael Sonnen, you've still got Benson Henderson, you've got your MVPs and Paul Daley's, you've got Ryan Bader. Obviously, it's not official just yet, but that should be official pretty soon. You've got Rory McDonald, right? That's just to name a few from the top of my head, right? If you were to put on perhaps an annual super show, for example, you've got enough there for such a solid, packed main card that could rival any top 5 fights in the UFC. The difference is the UFC can do that every month. Correct. The UFC can do that consistently, time and time and time again, whereas perhaps if Bellator was going to draw and take all of their superstars, they could maybe put on that type of show once or twice a year. And that's the difference. And like you mentioned in the previous question, Simon, in terms of the depth of the entire roster, the UFC could, like they did with the UFC 200, they could put a Jim Miller on the UFC Fight Pass prelims.
First fight of the night, that was, wasn't it?
Exactly. But yeah, I mean that's my answer to that question.
Yeah.
And, do you have a different take or?
No, I'm totally with you. It's all about strength and depth, and in saying that, it is in no way a criticism of what Bellator are doing. I think they're building their brand very well. I think they're being pretty sensible with the way they're going about it. But to compare them directly to the UFC is kind of unfair, because what they're doing is that they're at a completely different stage of development to the UFC. They have a big strong budget, much like the UFC does, but they're coming at it relatively as a young upstart in the sport, if that makes sense. And they've changed their business model away from the tournament format to the more traditional fight card format, and they're looking to build their own stars, and maybe in 10 years time they might be neck and neck with the UFC if they're well managed. Who knows? But right now, they're on their own path and doing things their own way, and it's an easy, lazy thing to do head-to-head comparisons between the two. But it's kind of unfair, I think, because they don't have that strength and depth.
And we'll see how the free agency market ends up panning out in the foreseeable future, because they certainly are keen to be adding to their roster. You still got the likes of Lorenz Larkin out there on the free agency market, and like I mentioned a few times on today's show, the UFC are trimming the fat, so to speak. I know that, for example, Frankie Edgar is on his last fight of his contract, and it's in a way unthinkable to think that Frankie Edgar wouldn't get re-signed by the UFC. But to be honest with you, under the WME-IMG ownership, I just don't think anything's for sure anymore. We just don't know what could potentially happen. And I think, somebody like Frankie Edgar, who's in his 30s, this may be his last big contract. He may want to maximize the amount of revenue he can potentially make here before retirement. Who knows how many more fights he's got left in the tank. He's been around for quite some time himself. So that was the last question from Sonny Danger. Really interesting set of questions this week. And that brings us to the end of that particular segment, Simon.
Yeah, brilliant. And thank you to everyone who sent questions in. Please do start getting your questions into us now for next week's show. You can tweet them to us at the BritPack MMA. Make sure that is in the tweet somewhere, even if you're tweeting directly to me or Sandhu. Make sure you get at the BritPack MMA in your tweet. That will alert it to everyone concerned, and Sandhu will like the ones that are going to go on the question list that week, and we'll get all the questions lined up. So if you want to get a question in on the show, little tip for you, get it in early, because we'll see them come in and they won't get buried under anything else. Please do check out the website at thebritpackmma.com. That's where all our stuff lives. You can find out more about the show, you can listen to past episodes on there, and all the myriad different ways that you can subscribe. But I might as well tell you while we're on here as well. So you can listen and subscribe via iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Acast. You leave us a review on iTunes if you're an iTunes subscriber. That helps spread the word about our little show as we look to head towards episode number 50. We've done the first 25. Now we've got another 25 to go before we get that half century. You can tweet us, as we mentioned earlier. You can tweet the show direct at the BritPack MMA. You can also get Sandhu at Sandhu MMA. And yours truly at Simon Head. Enjoy the fights this Saturday night. We're back on UFC pay-per-view duty. If you're in London and you want to watch the UFC live somewhere, then check out the Grosvenor Casino in Russell Square. It's somewhere that we've done a couple of podcasts from in the past. They've started doing more regular fight night events there. Beer, burger and a bet. It's like $8.95, I think it is. They've done it for boxing events, and I know they've been popular, and they've started doing UFC events as well, and they've been really pleased from talking to them about how they've been faring as well. And we've been there a couple of times, and from personal anecdotal experience, we can say it's a fun place to go and watch the fights. And so if you're in town, you want to get a few lads together and a few boys and girls together and go and watch the fights. It's not always easy to find somewhere to watch fights live, because the pubs aren't always open that late, and not everyone wants to stay up late and watch live fights. But the Grosvenor Casino in Russell Square is one of them. We'll ping out the link on social media, and we'll stick it at the bottom of the post on our website which will contain this very show. So if you fancy a bit of live action, check that out as well, and you can even lose your money on the roulette table afterwards. So yeah, that's pretty much all we have this week. Enjoy the fights this weekend. UFC 208, Holly Holm versus Germaine de Randamie. We will be back next week to pick over the bones of that event and look forward to the next one. But until then, enjoy the fights. We'll see you soon.